All right, then I would like to move on and invite the third presentation. Now, the third presenter is none other than myself. And today, just like marine microorganisms, I'm going to talk about marine microalgae and how they can be utilized to build a new bio industry going forward. Because I'm your chair, I would like to briefly introduce this slide. As you can see here, I've did diving for 4 months in the Antarctic Research Center. And on the right-hand side, you can see me studying and researching also microorganisms. The temperature difference is big between the two areas, but other than that, things were pretty much similar. And the lesson I learned was that the algae or the micro algae or planktons actually makes a huge difference to the potential of marine energy. Of course, I've studied their impact and influence on human beings, but although these marine microalgae, as you can see from the slide, is not visible before our eyes, you can only tell their colors. However, under this slide, you can see that they can absorb twice the amount of CO2 compared to their size, and CO2, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Those can be observed, and we call it doubling time. And some microalgae takes 1 day for doubling, sometimes 2 or 3 days for doubling time. Anyways, they are, I believe, a very important source of energy. Reports say that we have them in abundance, and compared to crops, the mass is 1/10. However, as I mentioned earlier, they can absorb CO2 twice the size of their body or the size, and therefore a significant amount of CO2 can be fixed underwater, and that CO2 removed from the atmosphere means that climate change can be prevented. So many scientists say that algae and microalgae are the most important sources going forward. As I mentioned earlier, going forward, compared to inland crops, their biomass is only 1/10. However, they produce about 50% of all oxygen produced on Earth, so they help us to breathe. And the Cretaceous deposits of marine algae is the source of oil and natural gas. So it means that we can use them as a source of energy. And where I live and study is the city of Busan, and we have a lot of fisheries, and they also come from the ocean, and they also rely on planktons. So from plankton, the fisheries would survive, and they would end up on our dinner tables. So they help us to breathe, they help us to power our life, and towards the end I will be talking more about it, but they can be also turned into cosmetic ingredients and turned into new materials for clothing and etc. So the microalgae looks like this. there are 7 to 8 materials that can be generated through photosynthesis. So it's a photosynthesis platform. As you can see from here, we have solar energy, CO2 and water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and once you have all these elements, then photosynthesis can take place inside. In starch and oil, polysaccharides, and proteins can be created, and from there we can generate hydrogen and also fatty acids, biodiesel, bioethanol, and natural products, new drugs, antioxidants can be created, and by separating these into two, we can also generate biogas, and they can be used as an ingredient for vaccines, immunology, and cancer treatments. So many scientists around the world are studying these microalgae in order for these applications. This is how they look like. Some are brown, some are red, some are green. In our lab, as you grow them, you can see that their colors would change, and we actually cultivate them for various purposes. So again, I believe that they have a lot of advantages. As I mentioned earlier, microalgae absorb a significant amount of CO2 compared to inland crops. As you can see on the right-hand side, you can see that biomass on the far left consume or absorb more greenhouse gas emitted in the atmosphere. And another advantage is listed here when it comes to water, land, protein, compared to inland crops. I believe that microalgae is a very economical in terms of the advantages that they bring. And we also have to understand if there is any hidden costs associated with these. Now, if there is too much hidden cost, for example, are there any poisons, medical costs, or do they destroy our ecosystem? And soil and water, do they get polluted, or is there any militarization costs, and is there any debt burden, taxes and interest? If compared to inland crops, I would say that hidden costs are far lower. Diesel and gasoline are currently used in order to power our cars. Now, it takes billions of years for gasoline to be produced. However, microalgae only requires this simple cycle: CO2, water, and nitrogen and phosphorus. By doubling them, we can produce oil. As you can see here, I have red and green, and they are fatty acids. And the one marked in yellow are the ones that can be turned into biodiesel. So since 2009 till today, we do have a lot of biodiesel-related research. For the first time in Korea, we have built this facility and from here, we are trying to produce biodiesel. Ansan, Yeonguk, and Micronesia, using the same systems, we are trying to compare and contrast their efficiency. On the right-hand side, you see something yellow, and this is biodiesel. In recent years, we were able to produce this result. 6 to 7 microalgae were studied. And the reason why I'm sharing with you this graph is because, again, we need to produce crude oil in order to get the gasoline that we want. Now, crude oil is like microalgae from the ocean. By combining both offshore and onshore in a hybrid method, we are studying microalgae to maximize the biodiesel output. Again, from the old ages, Cretaceous ages, microalgae would be sedimented, and over the years, they will be able to be used as biodiesel. Now, we are also studying whether there is a method to turn CO2 and have CO2 back in the microalgae. So this is to realize a net zero target by 2050. And I believe that amongst the many candidates, microalgae is the most promising candidate. Here, this is from NASA, and it's a short video, so take a look. You can see the greenhouse gases. Here it's 60s, 70s. You can see how the 80s, 95, 2000, 2010, 2015. Because of human activity and industrial activities, we've ended up emitting a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result, by continent, we can see that we have a significant amount of greenhouse gases emitted. Now, this is in 2006, African wildfire. And also in the Northern Hemisphere, you can see a lot of CO2, and this is in the winter. And USA, Europe, China, you can see how these greenhouse gases are flowing towards Korea. And this is because the Earth turns every 24 hours. And recently, we were able to realize the importance of CO2 and how CO2 can create climate emergency and climate crisis. And earlier, we were able to hear from Dr. Rabinin, but we actually thought that because of COVID-19, greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced. However, CO2 levels have increased by at least 2 to 3 ppm. So again, from a Earth engineering point of view, this is a huge burden. Now, what do you think this is? This is what we call pore, and this is how plants breathe. And inland crops would use these pores in order to absorb CO2. And in 2016, the scientists made a very shocking report. And what happens if there is too much CO2 or too much greenhouse gas emissions? Then they would close up their pores, because if there is two and they only need one, then they would need time to adapt, and they would simply close their pores. And these plants are not really keeping up with the amount of CO2 that we need to remove from the atmosphere. So that's why we have more and more greenhouse gas accumulated in the atmosphere. And here it shows greenhouse gas reduction versus microalgae. Per 1 liter, how much CO2 is being consumed. Many scientists actually carried out similar research, and as you can see from here, we have edible chlorella, and it can remove and absorb about 1 gram. But they take up about 7.3% of the arable land, and by utilizing these microalgae, then we can remove about 6.5 gigatons of carbon per year. Now, by 2030, we have to remove 300 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So allow me to share with you what this means. As you can see from here, 291 million tons of CO2 is something that we need to remove by 2030 compared to the 2018 levels. So what do you think the figure on the left-hand side means? So that's the size of Korea. So using microalgae, the amount of CO2 that we can absorb is 58 million tons. Now that's ideal. So for simple comparison, allow me to share with you this data. So if we were to utilize microalgae to remove CO2, then about 20% of 291 million tons can be removed. So with that understanding, we currently have two-track studies. First is biomass production. We're trying to work with local governments and businesses to maximize biomass production. And second, we are trying to utilize microalgae to absorb and remove CO2. So using our technologies, we have established three R&D/startup, and if successful, I believe that they will be able to contribute significantly to climate mitigation. And I would like to also talk about medicinal approach. So we need nutrients to survive, and this is also the case for microalgae. We need cells. Cells also need nutrients, and we have technologies being developed in order to also develop new drugs. And we need serums, and because human serums are limited, many researchers actually use FBS, or fetal bovine serum. And as you can see from here, this is very unethical, and this would be in direct competition of food resources. So using marine resources, we are trying to replace FPS. And during the past 6-7 years, we've been conducting some studies, and we are about 70% successful. And with regard to COVID-19 vaccines, I believe that we also need serums. And I believe that we are in the process of developing a serum using microalgae that can replace FPS. And of course, in order to make it widely available, it's important that the cost is low. I understand that in order to get one vaccine treatment shot, it's going to cost about 1 million Korean won or 1,000 US dollars. Now, it's not going to be that economical, and therefore, we are trying to develop this serum alternative using microalgae in order to neutralize virus and develop vaccines. So this is going to be like a AstraZeneca vaccine, and culturing cost can be significantly lowered using our technology. Next, I'd like to move on and talk about food production. The graph that you see on the top is beef production, and 60 kilograms of CO2 would be emitted in order to produce a certain amount of beef. So from the livestock industry, there is a lot of greenhouse gases emitted. Globally, they take up about 50% of the CO2 emitted. So it's very urgent that we reduce those greenhouse gases. And using the microalgae-based serum, we've also developed this cell-based culture meat. We've actually transferred this technology into a startup, and every time they have technological bottlenecks, we're going to come together to seek breakthroughs. Again, I think that food security is important, but at the same time, greenhouse gas emissions reduction is going to be very important. So I believe that using our technology, we can attain both of these goals. We have a lot of elderly population with cognitive impairments. Those in their 70s, 80s suffer from cognitive impairments, and we believe that we can also utilize our marine resources to produce functional food and help heal cognitive impairments. About 150 trillion won is going to be required in order to look after these elderly patients, and I believe that our technology can lessen that burden. And the size of our land is very small, and therefore we need to be really creative when it comes to how we're going to utilize that limited land. And this is a case in Germany, and they are actually using this building in order to use algae to power the building. And this is a concept. And on the rooftop, you have bioreactor to grow microalgae, and you also can do a converged energy production. And CO2 can be significantly lowered. And in lower stories, you can also grow lettuces and also cabbages and etc. And here you can see that this is something that is very realistic. So here we have solar PV and also microalgae brought together in a building. So all in all, you can see that the goal is clear. We are trying to minimize the impact and damage to the existing industry. And using our technologies, target number 2 is to generate a lot of biomasses while reducing CO2, and at the same time create new materials and also cut back on CO2. Only then I believe that we can realize our NDC goal by 2030. So again, I believe that using our technologies, we can strike two birds with one stone. In red, you can see the amount of CO2 emitted per person. It's 6.65 tons. From the transport sector and from the energy sector, it's 3.03 tons. And if 50 million people come together, then that means we can reduce 1.2 billion tons from energy. Again, I know that it's only sounds very ideal, but I believe that if businesses come together with the academia, then I believe that we can realize that 2030 NDC target. Thank you.